Great. So, welcome to everybody who's joining to this session on social protection for gender responsive and disability inclusive climate action in rural settings, where we're going to be presenting a couple of papers that have come out of the STAAR project. So, we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so I'm your moderator today. My name's Matthew Walsham. I'm a social protection specialist at FAO, and I work specifically on the links between social protection and climate action. So FAO was, with the STAAR facility, the commissioner of the reports that we're going to present and discuss today, which were delivered by Oxford Policy Management. And really they're two sister efforts to explore the issues of gender inclusion and broader inclusion issues, including people with disabilities, within social protection or climate action, with a focus on rural settings particularly. So before I introduce, we've got an excellent set of speakers and moderators. I just want to say this is part of a broader series of events around gender responsive and inclusive social protection. So this is the third of these events. So this series is exploring different dimensions of gender responsive and inclusive social protection. And here our focus is particularly on how to do this in relation to climate action and the links to social protection as an instrument for delivering inclusive climate action. So this is a link which will be repeated again at the end of the presentation, at the end of the session, just so that you can record and give us your feedback on how the session went, so that we can help to improve similar sessions going forward. Okay, so a few things about this session. Firstly, it's being recorded, so it will be available afterwards on socialprotection.org, and all of those of you attending will be able to get it there, but you can also access it through the website. There are automatic captions available, so instructions there on how to get this. There's a chat box so that you can present yourself in the chat to everybody else who's attending. And there's also a Q&A box, so please put your questions into the Q&A box. So if it's a question for our speakers or for our discussants, please put that in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, so that we can kind of separate those out from the more general discussion. And as you will have noticed, we have international sign interpretation throughout the session. So we'll be trying to speak as clearly and slowly as possible so our sign interpreters can keep up. So there's captioning and there's international sign interpretation. Broadly speaking, the flow of the session is 5 minutes introduction from me, and then we'll move straight into two different presentations from three speakers, so they'll split those across the two different presentations. We'll have discussants. We've got three excellent discussants who will respond to the different presentations, taking about 25 minutes, and then we should have about half an hour. I mean, it says 28 minutes. We'll try and keep as much of the 28 minutes as possible for Q&A, and then some closing remarks at the end. Great. Now, before I introduce the speakers and the discussants, I just want to say just a little bit about the background to this session. So, the initial idea came up, a year and a half ago now, when there was a call for proposals through the STAAR facility, which is an FCDO-supported facility to explore different aspects of gender inclusion and also crises and social protection. We at FAO put in a proposal really to explore how to make social protection for climate action more inclusive. So at the kind of general policy level, we've seen a lot of traction in the linkages between social protection and climate action, and a particularly strong message around the role that social protection has to make climate action more inclusive. And we can see, COP30 is coming up. It's going to be very visible there. There's a leaders' declaration that has social protection front and center, be launched ahead of COP. So we're seeing real movement here. But our interest was, okay, well, if we're saying about making making climate action more inclusive, we need to ensure that actually the way we're doing this is both inclusive of women and girls, and gender inclusive, as well as inclusive of specific population groups, including in rural contexts, who might otherwise be excluded from climate action. So what we wanted to do is really help us to think through how do we move from this broad policy agenda to actually doing this in practice, but recognizing this is an emerging field. So exploring emerging practice in programs and policies across the world that can give us insights into how we make social protection for climate action more inclusive. And that means in terms of gender responsiveness, but also in terms of the inclusion of specific population groups. Now, when we pitched this as a whole, we also then thought, look, in one particular area, we know that there's unlikely to be good evidence of how to do this, and that's for people with disabilities. And so there's really a sister piece, the second piece that will be presented today, what came from this, where we thought, okay, well, as well as thinking about this at a general level, we should dig down in a bit more detail into the inclusion of people with disabilities specifically, in order to understand how we might do this moving forwards. And it's framed as more as a scoping review, because we understood that there are unlikely to be very good examples of how to do this in practice out there, or certainly many examples. And I think that's been borne out in practice. So what we're going to see today are basically two sister pieces: a broader piece on gender inclusion and the inclusion of population groups within climate action through social protection, and then a specific piece focusing in on social protection and people with disabilities for climate action. And the final thing I should say, so hopefully these two pieces will speak to each other very nicely. Neither of them are published yet, so both will be out later this month. But in fact, I think that's an excellent opportunity really for us to, at the last stage of development, to take in some of the discussions that we have later on in this session. So the authors are all here, they can engage in this discussion today, and it's an opportunity to shape, I guess, the final report's recommendations and conclusions. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. So we will start off with Paola Pereznieto, who will make the first presentation. She's a senior social policy consultant, working in this case for OPM on the piece, along with a broader team that she will mention. And then we'll turn to Anna Solórzano and Joseph Munyandamutsa, who are both going to speak to this piece on social protection and disability inclusion for climate action. And then we've got three excellent discussants. So I'm really pleased to say that Mel Gomez Silva is joining us from Mozambique, and Mika and Paul from India. So both of the projects and proposed programs they're going to speak to are case studies within the first report. So we're going to have some reflection from them about what this issue means to them in their context, some response to the findings of the reports and reflections going forward. And then Patience Ogolo-Dixon, who is a founder of an organization advocating for the rights of people with disabilities in Nigeria, who's done some work on disability inclusion in climate action that touched also on social protection. So she's going to reflect more broadly on what this agenda means for her and the work that she is supporting. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of what we're going to be covering today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn to Paola Pereznieto to kick us off with our first presentation. Over to you, Paola.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So I'm going to share the slide deck to start us off. So yes, this was a very interesting piece that was case study based, as you will see now. Sorry, just taking a sec to be able to share this. If not, we can go with, okay, so it's there. Great, so what was the objective of this the first of these two studies? To identify emerging good practices on gender equity, disability, and social inclusive in social protection for climate action in rural areas. So our analysis focuses on this in rural areas, which is an important framing point. And a very key point here is that we were looking for practices that were doing this explicitly, so not as some byproduct of implementation, but very implicit in program design and implementation. And the goal of this is to provide actionable, as Matt was saying, provide actionable insights for embedding inclusion in social protection in climate action, and ensuring that we provide some ideas and insights on how this can be achieved and ways to make this more inclusive. So we'll go to the approach in a second. And yes, it was commissioned by FAO under the STAAR facility. So the methodological approach, we conducted an in-depth literature review to identify the case studies, then to analyze the case studies, but also very important, so looking at papers for framing this analysis. A lot of work has been done in the last couple of years around this subject, and then to understand the context where we were working in. The key informant interviews were central to the piece, sort of validating the analysis from the desk review, but also many of these projects are quite new. So we really relied on the key informant interviews with multiple stakeholders to provide us insights of how they have evolved from design to implementation, and some of the successes and challenges that we were finding. So that those were central to the case studies. We have 5 in-depth case studies that we selected purposefully to reflect sort of regional diversity, different types of social protection programming, and also all of them have a strong gender, disability and social inclusion focus. So all of them have a focus on gender, and then different, you'll see different case studies focus on different vulnerable groups. And then the aim is then through that we provide some interesting insights, findings, and lessons learned. We have an analytical framework with 3 pillars. The first pillar of it draws on Cosella and McCord's 2023 work on climate functions of social protection. And so there are 5 functions that they identify for social protection in climate action: reducing all the underlying vulnerability to climate change, responding to climate shocks and disasters, offsetting the negative welfare impacts of climate transition policies, facilitating climate change adaptation options, and then contributing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration. So these are possible climate functions, and we looked across the case studies at which they were relevant in each of the case studies, as you will see, focusing particularly on the 3 latter ones. Obviously knowledgeable that social protection has an underlying function for vulnerability reduction, but in this case, for vulnerabilities that are particularly triggered through climate change. In the case, then another pillar is we drew on Bala and colleagues' work in social protection in rural contexts for climate action, and these are dimensions of climate responses that can be conducted. So adoption of climate-sensitive agricultural practices, diversification into less climate vulnerable livelihoods, improved natural resource management, and climate change mitigation and reduction of impact of mitigation policies. So we'll see how the different case studies drew on some of or are working on some of these areas. And lastly, we also drew on the social protection solar system that provides a systems approach to analyzing social protection from policy, program design, and implementation. And we will see how our findings fall into these different dimensions of the system. Throughout the main focus of our analysis, where we see we add value is this gender equity, disability, and social inclusion focus. And why? So a GEDSI approach. Why is this important? So we know that climate change deepens existing inequalities with women, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and others facing greater risks when excluded from decision-making around climate action, and programming and social protection can empower change when gender and inclusion responsive programs strengthen agency, when they reduce vulnerabilities, and when they really enable equitable participation in adaptation and mitigation. We have seen from the evidence that intersectional GEDSI systems deliver stronger outcomes on social protection. So applying gender equality, disability, social inclusion lens helps expose structural barriers and ensure meaningful participation. So we know this already from the evidence in general on social protection, and then we apply this lens to climate social protection, climate action, and very importantly, inclusive systems drive just transitions that touch on these vulnerable groups. So we drew on the gender equality continuum that looks at cross programs, whether they're from gender discriminatory to gender transformative. In particular, in our case, the case studies we focus on are gender responsive or gender transformative, depending on whether they just provide support that acknowledges and reacts to these barriers, but in some cases they really try to provide structural change to reduce barriers faced by women and other groups. So it's important then to highlight that we look across gender across the board, but then highlight specific work on different vulnerable groups for just transitions. So as I was saying before, we looked at 5 case studies in different contexts. So I'll provide a brief overview here of them. As Matt was saying, we have the privilege of having Mika, who will talk further on Errata, and Melk, who will talk about Link in greater detail during the discussion. So I'll talk more about this, but this sort of brief analysis here pulls out what the different highlights, how we looked across different types of social protection programs. So Bolsa Verde is an environmentally conditioned cash transfer program. I'll talk about that in a minute, what that means. Errata is a project within India's flagship public works program, the MREGA. In the case of Mozambique, it's also a public works program, PASP, that works across the program and country. And then within that, Link, which is a specific project focusing on climate action. The Pereznieto program in Paraguay, that's linked to the country's flagship cash transfer program. And then the Takabo program in Mauritania, which is now piloting an economic inclusion program that's focused on climate action. So we look at these 5 case studies. Each of them had different target groups, as we see there, and then we highlight how they work across the climate functions that we were mentioning, and we highlight in this slide some of the GEDSI findings. Let me talk a little bit more about some of these programs. So in the case of Brazil, the Bolsa Verde program, which is an ECCT, is focused to support traditional peoples, so indigenous and other traditional groups in low-income households in protected or conservation areas in Brazil. So these are areas that are being protected for forest conservation to promote sustainable land use and improve well-being, obviously reducing incentives for deforestation. And this is being linked to social protection. It delivers in the sense triple climate benefits. It supports adaptation through sustainable practices, stabilizes forest-based livelihoods during these transitions, and mitigates emissions from deforestation. So this is very important. And it's integrated within Brazil's flagship cash transfer program, Bolsa Familia, which is targeted at the poorest households. And it's linked through Brazil's very sophisticated, strong sort of a social registry system, the Cadastro Único, that extends sort of links these 2 programs, the beneficiaries in these 2 programs, and it extends environmental incentives to vulnerable forest-dependent communities to promote inclusive climate resilience. It has a gender-sensitive design with 92% of payments to women in households, so strengthening their financial autonomy. But we did find that it doesn't have a very strong framework for gender responsiveness and inclusiveness or transformation, although it works very actively with indigenous people. So this is something that can be strengthened, but it does have strong monitoring system based on the broader social protection system in the country. It could be strengthened or enhanced with more specific gender disaggregated climate indicators. So as I was saying, I'll let our colleagues talk about ERADA as part of MREG and LINK as part of PASP in a moment, in the case of India and Mozambique. In the case of Paraguay, the PROESA program is also an environmentally conditioned cash transfer program that's linked to a cash transfer program for poverty reduction that works across the country. So that's called Tecopora. And in this case, the ECCT works in specific regions of the country that are climate vulnerable. And it provides climate smart agroforestry, reforestation, and clean energy support to promote climate resilient livelihoods and reforestation. So again, as with Bolsa Verde, supports adaptation via diversified farming. In this case, it also supports the reduction in emissions by distributing efficient cook stoves. And it seeks to cushion transition impacts for the rural poor by really providing alternative livelihoods and ways of and different agroforestry models, which have been successful. Importantly, in the case of PROESA, it's aligned with national frameworks for sort of the national adaptation policies and the nationally determined contributions, which really sort of frames this in the context of climate action linking to social protection. Is co-financed by the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and links very explicitly poverty reduction and climate action objectives within a coherent government strategy, which is important. It embeds gender and indigenous inclusion throughout. It has a mandatory 50% targeting of female participation, but more than that, it really promotes participation through more culturally sensitive approaches. It promotes indigenous representation. It has, the National Indigenous Institute is part of the governance structure to ensure that there's adequate and effective participation of indigenous groups, but women within leadership of indigenous groups as well, which is very interesting to see. And it operates a participatory multi-level governance model, which involves also FAO operating at the country level in collaboration, in support of the government, and a number of national and local sub-actors who work on this. Then the Tackable program, okay, so I'm seeing I'm running out of time, so I'll go very quickly just through the Tackable economic inclusion pilot in Mauritania. What's interesting about this in particular, so it's a cash transfer program, cash plus in the sense that it focused very strongly on productive brands and training schemes to support populations that are vulnerable to climate change. So it supports through technical support and some grants sort of in a specific area in Mauritania, Hodechargi, drought-tolerant crops, livestock improvements, and green micro-enterprises. What's very interesting in its very gender-responsive design is that it accounts for challenges women might face in terms of accessing land, but also time constraints and care burdens. And it tries to address these within the design of the economic incentive, the economic livelihood strengthening programs. And then also that it targets refugees. So half of the population targeted to 2,500 households are refugees, and the other half are host households, so trying to promote social inclusion through this mechanism. So this has just started, this pilot, and it's meant to generate evidence then to expand similar models elsewhere. So I'll go quickly through some of our key findings, some emerging lessons. So integration of climate and social protection drives resilience. So policy coherence enhances sustainable impact, which is very important. So we can illustrate that by Mozambique, the case of Mozambique links program that operationalizes the nationally determined contributions and their national adaptation plans by serving as a channel for implementing adaptation at the local level. Melk will talk more about this, but they have embedded the work Link does within local adaptation plans, which are designed in a participatory manner, and then linking those to local budgets, which is very important. Participatory planning fosters inclusive climate action, so community-based diagnostics and planning strengthens ownership and equity. Across the program, we have seen strong participation. For example, in the case of India's ERADA, they have used GIS mapping and living income benchmarks to help marginalized groups design climate resilient public works that respond to their needs, which is very important. We have seen that while there have been important gender gains, they frequently outpace some of the more intersectional inclusion dimensions for other vulnerable groups. So there needs to be more work around this broader inclusion dimensions, but work is being done in the sense. We saw, for example, as I was saying before, that Bolsa Verde could improve framing, explicit framing and monitoring around gender equity to have more transformative outcomes. Key findings also: external financing spurs innovation but challenges sustainability. We have seen important innovations fostered by some of the donors, the GCF, the World Bank, GIZ, amongst others. But obviously, as we know, this needs to elicit sort of domestic ownership of financing, as we see more in the case of Brazil and India, to ensure expansion and sustainability. In the case of, we see also that disaggregated monitoring enhances accountability and learning, and enables more outcome facing results, not just output level. So we need to look at how this is designed from the outset in terms of having disaggregated indicators. We can see some of that is illustrated by some of our cases where this is being done successfully. So just very quickly, I know I've gone over time, so just 1 minute to go across these some of these important elements around as I was saying, the social protection system. So some lessons in terms of policies, the importance of embedding climate inclusion objectives in national social protection strategies and legal frameworks for sustainability, including social protection, as I was saying, in some sort of the broader policy frameworks, fostering cross-sector coordination. This is very essential point. So because it works across climate action and inclusion, then you need coordination across different ministries. So ministries of rural development or agriculture coordinating with ministries of gender or social development, in addition to the agency in charge of social protection. So we have seen where this is working, that this coordination happens at the national, but then also at the local level. And this is essential. Securing domestic finances with financing, which we have talked about, and MEL frameworks. Then we have seen in terms of implementation, operational, I think this through GEDSI, toolkit safeguards, segregated data, innovative targeting that have resulted in positive results, promoting participatory planning and design. Then at the implementation level, building institutional staff capacity is essential. We're talking about many different dimensions, and many of these case studies that we looked at are embedding capacity building, peer-to-peer learning at the local level to ensure that this is embedded and then can be moved forward in a more sustainable way, accounting for both climate action and inclusion, the participatory dimension that I had mentioned, and meaningful participation. So these enablers we've talked about, it's just a synthesis of this. I won't go through this. So to give the floor to my colleagues, we have mentioned all of these, but you'll see them later when you receive the presentation. And just this last slide that talks about pathways to social protection for inclusive climate action, reiterating some of the points that we have mentioned. Gender responsive or transformative inclusive social protection needs to be a cornerstone of just inclusive climate transition, not an add-on, but an essential cornerstone from the outset. Integrating GEDSI across social protection functions to ensure sustained commitment, ensure meaningful participation of all the different vulnerable groups that we have talked about, and not just a tokenistic approach to inclusion. strengthening local and subnational capacities. This is essential for delivering rural contexts where capacity might be weak. This is very essential, this coordination and governance mechanisms. And lastly, enhance agency and adaptive capacity for women, vulnerable groups in rural context through more intersectional approaches. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for extending my time. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Paola. I think we gave you an unenviable task of trying to summarize all of this in 15 minutes. So thank you for moving as quickly as you could through a lot of information, I think, and really fascinating information. So obviously, people will be able to go to the report to get kind of more of the detail on this, but we've also got the Q&A session later and the reflections from our discussants to dig down, I think, on some of that detail. But just to say thank you for that. And I mean, Paola led the whole process. So she's been immersed in this over the last year. And congratulations on pulling out all of these interesting elements, I think, from a very fascinating piece of work. So I'm going to head now straight over to Joseph and to Anna to make the second presentation. And just to flag up in advance, I might be a little bit tighter on timescales on this one. So if you could do your best, that would be extremely appreciated. Thank you very much. Over to you, Joseph.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. Of course, this is we'll be taking you through the scoping review for disability inclusive social protection for climate action in rural areas, which is a piece of work we have been conducting. The work is being implemented by OPM team, I and my colleagues, but also in collaboration with FAO and EAI. Of course, this piece of work was supported or funded by FCDO. Next. Yes, the next slide. The next again. Yes, okay. So to start with introduction and the key principles, the next. It is this piece of work, of course, the goal was to identify key principles and the best practices that are guiding disability inclusive social protection programming for rural climate action in low and middle income countries. So, of course, this was a qualitative research. We conducted a desk review looking at different literature which exists. But also we conducted key informant interviews, conducted 8 interviews with people from different expertise, but also included 2 organizations of persons with disabilities. Next. Yes, for an introduction part of this work, evidence there that persons with disabilities face many intersectional challenges, which leave them particularly vulnerable to the impact of the climate change. So another evidence that is existing to the body of the literature is that social protection programs have a key role to play in supporting inclusive climate action, particularly in rural areas. But now the challenge of the issue is to ask how can we ensure that these social protection programs are fully disability inclusive. So this is the question that guided us throughout our research. Next. Of course, there's a global evidence. Next. There's a global evidence about data of persons with disability. We know that 16% of the global population have disability, and the majority of persons with disability live in low and middle income countries. And persons with disability face additional cost to meet their basic need when compared to the person without disability. And there is evidence that from the rural areas, people from rural areas often face particular challenges, which can be due to geographical landscape, accessibility, information, literacy level, etc. And then we had kind of a conceptual framework that was guiding us throughout this research. One was the social model of disability that recognized that impairment, disability is not only the result from the impairment, but from surrounding environment that restricts the person from the participation. But also there's a concept of nothing about us without us. That is why we also brought on board organizations of person with disabilities to bring their voice into the research to ensure that their choice, their view is among the priorities, so that they participate in the policy making which impacts their lives. So, of course, we have a three dimension of disability inclusion. We have climate action and social protection. We had kind of cross-cutting principles across the three dimensions. One is a right-based approach, which sees effective service provision and the political inclusion as a right rather than a privilege. It could be either for disability inclusion or either a climate change action. The participation approach is also another cross-cutting principle, disability or climate action, where the person with disability and the participants in the climate action program should play a key role from the program design, setting their voice so that their voice is also counted when from the design throughout the implementation. There's also recognition of heterogeneity of needs, considering different needs of different persons with disabilities. There's also adopting a twin-track approach, which ensures that persons with disability are included in the mainstream programming on equal basis with others without any discrimination. On the other hand, receiving additional support targeted according to their needs, because they have specific needs according to their impairments and their disabilities. So these are cross-cutting principles that also were identified and guided our research. Next. Of course, we used also a solar system. I think this was presented in the previous presentation with Paola. So we used the same solar system to guide us throughout the research. And I'll hand over Anna to take us through the following slide.
Thank you,
Anna,
Joseph. Thank you. So can we go to the next slide, the next one, please? So on the first level of the solar system, we have policies, coordination, and financing. Next one, please. And when we see policies, we didn't find any systematic review that addresses like the interlinkages between disability, climate, and social protection. So based on the very little evidence that we found, there is very little integration taking place. And as Paola on the previous presentation explained, policy coherence is very important because it enhances the sustainability of impacts. So this is an important gap that we found on this review. And just to give you an example, only 6% of the NDCs include, 9% include or discuss disability inclusion. Can we move on to the next one, please? So a nice example is the Cambodia's nationally determined contributions, the new one. And this one was developed through broad consultations, including with organizations of people with disabilities. It features a section on disability, and it also has a standalone section on social protection, where it recognizes social protection as an adaptation and as an enabler of adaptation, and explicitly recognizes the role of social protection in building the climate resilience of people with disabilities. This is important because then the country's targets will also have this approach in terms of social protection for people with disabilities in the context of climate change. The next one, please. So beyond the obvious interministerial collaboration challenges that we always see in these multi-sectoral work streams, another very important area here of collaboration is organizations of persons with disabilities. This is critical. They advocate for the interests and needs of persons with disabilities and ensure that policies and programs remain adequate and relevant for them. And what is also very important about this coordination with them is that it's not about just ticking the box of consulting them, but it's supposed to be about active participation of OPDs in the design, planning, and also on the implementation, because we have also seen that even if the legal framework or policy frameworks recognizes people with disability, if the OPDs are not the part of the implementation, then the practice is not necessarily going to take place. Next slide, please. So we focus in terms of financing in the area of international funding for climate action as a potential source of financing for disability inclusive social protection. We found very little evidence of this already taking place. It's an area of improvement. Based on the recent paper by FAO and GCF, we found only 6 disability inclusive social protection programs being funded by GCF. It's an area of improvement, but a starting point. Next slide. So in terms of like key recommendations in this level of the solar system is conduct audits of national policies to see if they are how they are addressing the other 2 topics. Absolutely advocate for the inclusion of these areas throughout in the different policies, but also in the financing. And in terms of coordination, always with OPDs at the center, we need to make sure that also the different stakeholders have the necessary skills, that they're building their capacities also to integrate this area of work. Now, moving on to the next slide, I'm going to move now to the second level of the solar system, which is programs. The next one, please. So as different frameworks and evidence explain, like the main types of programs that contribute to climate action are cash transfers for climate shock response, public works programs, Cash Plus, and ECCTs. Paola mentioned these programs in the previous presentation, so I'm not going to stop to explain them. But just like a very high level finding is that there are, again, very few examples of disability inclusive approaches in these type of programs. Which is it's an important area of improvement. So if we can move on to the next slide, in terms of like program design, some of the key general principles would be that firstly, inclusion is not going to happen serendipitously. Programs must proactively include persons with disability as a priority group from planning to implementation. Usually they are under the target group of vulnerable groups, but sometimes this gets lost and gets hidden. So they need to have like that specific focus on persons with disability. For that, we would need data, not only on climate change and short-term climate shocks, but also on how these are affecting them in terms of the different vulnerabilities that they are already facing and the disability status. And then, as my colleague Joseph mentioned, we would need to mainstream the twin track approach, which basically means that the people with disabilities need to have the opportunity to participate in mainstream programming, even when we're talking about productive investments, but also receive the adaptations and the services tailored to their own specific needs. So just moving on to the next slide, please. In terms of these promotive programs that have like productive objectives, we know that these are usually focused on able-bodied people, so they will indirectly discriminate people with disabilities. But there's no reason why this should happen. There is a way where adjustments and appropriate livelihood options can be offered to accommodate people with different types of and severity of disability. And there are examples that we found not only from social protection, but also from organizations and working at the grassroots level that can be scaled up at the level of national systems. It's also important to say that we need to focus on skills development because these beyond the program durations, because these are then sustainable and also transferable to other livelihood options. Again, this is just wanted to emphasize the importance of not looking and having this vision of persons with disability as passive members. They are active members and can take place on economic activities that are sometimes pursued through social protection and climate action. So the next slide, we do have an example with the Disability Inclusive Graduation Project in Uganda that did have like a transformative approach to include persons with disability throughout. It followed the twin track approach with tailored support for participants with disabilities, but it had many layers. It had financial inclusion, livelihood promotion, assistive devices, work adaptations, life skills training, advocacy, and social cohesion activities at the level of the community also to address stigma. There are also other examples that were presented by Paola, for example, the LINK program in Mozambique and the MREGA that we will hear more about it with the discussants that also include persons with disability. Now, moving on to the last level of the solar system, the implementation, I will give back the floor to my colleague, Joseph.
Yeah, thank you so much. Before we go to the conclusion part of our presentation, I just want to highlight the solar system. So next slide, please. Next. Yeah. So for the implementation to be disability inclusive, there is a three layer. There's disability data, there's climate data, and poverty vulnerability data that need to be considering the needs of person with disability. We know that concerning disability, most of the existing data are focusing on medical determinant of disability, which is narrow. But also there is no, the link is limited between disability registries and social protection management information systems. When it comes to the climate change, there's geospatial data concerning maybe the floods, the drop, or heat, etc. So to understand the historical pattern of the different predicting future trends concerning climate change. There's also, for the climate risk and disability status should be tracked as indicators of vulnerability as well as the poverty. But of course, there is a challenge here that this data is not frequently updated and may miss some vulnerable households. Next. Next slide. Yes, I'll be using a few minutes to explain. For the implementation, there is the issue of communication and eligibility. There is inclusive eligibility criteria. To be inclusive, we need to consider disability severity, individual needs of person with disability, rather than household consideration. There is also to consider that the care also, support and the care is also needed for caregivers. So to ensure that have effective communication for use multiple modalities with braille and the large print materials, local sign language interpreter. We need transcript, audio messages for people with visual loss, assistive technology for hearing or communication, door-to-door outreach to facilitate people with reduced mobility, but also to consider inclusive and disability-friendly language when we are communicating everything about disability and the climate change. Next slide, I think I have a few minutes. For service delivery and the participation, we need to show that services are really accessible to all persons, including persons with disability, include digitalization of payment, livelihood, visitation, and every kind of service delivery needs to be disability inclusive. But also we need to ensure that participation is the key, including participation from early stage of designing the program, including participation of the OPDs, Organization of Persons with Disabilities, but also to provide capacity building for non-familiar staff to understand disability inclusion and how they can be involved. So as a concluding slide, Anna, could you please take us to this concluding slide, please? Thank you.
Yes. Well, just to invite you to read the publication where we will explain this in more detail, but just to say that social protection is a powerful tool to support climate resilience of persons with disabilities. It will combine rights-based approaches with climate justice. So it's really an important arena an important agenda to move forward. But for this, we definitely need more research We need more evidence, and we need to advocate, because crucially, we will need a political will in order also to advance this agenda. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, Anna, for a second tour of the solar system in 15 minutes, which is, again, impressive. There's a huge amount of material to, I think, go into in the report itself, but I think that gave a very good sense of the kind of key messages. So thanks very much for that. And before we move to the discussions, just to say, yeah, if you've got questions, if you've got thoughts that you want to put to any of the presenters, please put those into the Q&A. We'll definitely have time for a good round of questions at the end of the session. Without further ado, I'm going to turn to our discussants. So first, Melk Gomez-Silva and Mika Hannah-Paul. We then have a third discussant, Patient Agola Dixon, who I'll introduce after those two. Perhaps Melk, if you can go first. Melk's from Save the Children, Mozambique, where he works on the LINK project, which also links to the PASS Public Works Programme there. And Melk's going to, as well as introduce himself and the project a little bit, we've asked both of our discussants on working on specific programmes to explain to us a bit why is this issue of gender responsive and inclusive climate action a priority for them, and to highlight maybe an area of opportunity and a key challenge in relation to the findings that the speakers have been presenting on this topic as a whole. So, Mika, I can see you have your camera turned on. Melk, are you ready for me to hand over to you? Yeah, Melk. So over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So again, my name is Melk Gomes. I am the Climate Change and Disaster Reduction Advisor for Save the Children based in Mozambique. And I also provide support to the LINK project that is in focus today. So maybe let me start to bring a bit of the context. The LINK project is funded by the Green Climate Fund. It is implemented by Save the Children International, but very close implementation with the government from both sides, on the environment side and also from the social protection side. At the core, LINK supports a locally led adaptation approach that integrates decentralized climate resilience planning. So basically, through the local adaptation plans, the integration of the local adaptation plans with the Mozambican Productive Social Action Program. So here, just to highlight, I think, the opportunity to build on existing policies and existing mechanisms. So the project doesn't bring something new, but it is really about strengthening the government systems and mechanisms in place, which is, I think, the opportunity that we used based on existing experience in country to strengthen this process. So it has been quite helpful in the dialogue with government and also engaged in the implementation of the activities. So this also looks in terms of, the fact that social protection, based on the existing experience, we learned that it has become a strategic entry point for climate resilience. As many of you might know, that Mozambique faces recurrent droughts, floods, and cyclones all the pack. And in that context, women, especially those heading households, children, and are very much affected by that events, the extreme events, considering the poverty level, the number of activities they carry on every day, but also in terms of limitations to access to land or credit. That is the reality. So integrating climate adaptation within social protection as LINK models propose, it's ensuring that public works and livelihood activities not only provides income support, but also builds adaptive capacity. Just to say that the public work, the PASS program, being a social protection program, has two main components in Mozambique. One is the public works, benefiting from a cash transfer benefit, and also the livelihood activities, that is basically a graduation model. Over the time, it has been difficult to governments to really support the second component. So the link project makes possible to channel the Green Climate Fund into this component to help and benefit the development of income generation, look in terms of a more climate resilient opportunities. And this is built based on existing community networks, where we make sure women, especially the female-headed households, are represented. And we make sure that also OPDs that are based on the ground are part of this process. And this process, starting from the decentralized planning process with the local adaptation plans, where communities are to identify priorities, climate resilience priorities, and in this case, related to livelihood diversification. So based on that priorities, and then the project comes in with funding and make sure that these activities are developed. So integrating climate adaptation in this case is opportunity for as a practical model for the decentralized adaptive planning that feeds into the national system. So as I said in the beginning, it all builds on existing policy and existing mechanisms. So community identify climate resilience priorities, and then which are implemented through the existing social protection program, the PASP. With that, I think we create a cycle that is about adaptation priorities, strengthening social protection. I would complement my contribution to the discussion, look in terms of course, everything is perfect. So existing challenges are still remaining, and it's basically considering institutional coordination, bring all the institutional government institutional background together and well coordinated, and of course the level of capacity that leads into questions how to make it sustainable in terms of finance. But the model already, I think, point out for a solution that is looking for existing climate financing. If we can increase that, then we can continue support this kind of approach. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Over to you, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Malk. That's really helpful and really insightful. And just also thank you to you and the team for engaging with this process throughout. I think that Mozambique is a really interesting example where you can see this integrated into the strategies, the NDC, the NAP, and then you can see here, as the report goes into, there was a precursor pilot program that was used to kind of design some of these principles, and then expanding into a bigger program where we can these principles can then be applied to the government social protection program. And as you concluded, I mean, that doesn't mean that everything works perfectly. Institutional coordination is still a challenge, capacity is still a challenge, financial sustainability is still a challenge. But the journey that Mozambique has been going through seems to me kind of quite instructive and helpful for others setting out along this path as well. So thanks very much, Malk. Okay, great. So heading over to Mika now from GIZ in India, who works on several programs, but all linked to the MGN Riga Public Works program. So over to you, Mika.
Thank you, Matthew. Good evening from India. First of all, thank you for including us in this study, and it has been very fruitful discussions. And I think it's also great how much I can relate to Melk and other colleagues also talking about their own programs. So like Matthew said, I work for the GIZ in India, and I have been engaging mainly with what we call MG-NREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is also an act, a rule of law in India, which was launched in 2006 and is probably the world's largest public works program with almost a coverage of 140 million registered families and spends 8 to 10 billion euros a year. I think when we talk about inclusivity, before we go into what we have done in GIZ through our projects, I think it's very important to note that MNREGA by itself has been designed as a very inclusive program. The most interesting factor being that it's a universal safety net, an entitlement that is literally available to the entire rural population in India, and we are huge, right? A 1 billion population, of which almost 60% still resides in rural areas. So there is no conditionality. It's a universal safety net, which by itself in design makes it very, very inclusive. So I could also go back to my own village tomorrow and tell them I don't have a job and apply for a job. And the act, because it is a rule of law, it actually puts a lot of conditions in its design that says that if I apply for a job, I should be provided a job within 15 days, or I should be provided with an unemployment allowance. And then once I do a job, I should be paid within 15 days. So I think by all these very key features that we have within the act itself, that's one of the very striking inclusive features of MG Narega. And it is available, like I said, across the country. Now, beyond being universal, what the Act has also done is to say that they prioritize vulnerable communities. So there are 8 categories of vulnerable communities they list in the Act, which includes tribal and indigenous households. We also have lower caste populations in India, which we consider vulnerable. We have women-headed households, also persons with disabilities, especially since we're talking quite a bit about disability inclusion today. So they are also considered as a key category among the vulnerable households. So while everybody could do public works and earn wages for the work they do up to 100 days in a year, what comes out of public works is rural infrastructure. And you could create an infrastructure in your own household only if you are from one of the vulnerable communities. Also, if you are from one of these 8 communities, then you would get priority to get the work as well. So that ways, there are interesting conditionalities that are put in the Act. So only if I'm a women-headed household or from a tribal community, I could use MG Narega to construct a house or a plantation or a toilet in my own house. And the other part that makes it interesting is also the list of works that MG Narega is able to do. So of course, starting out in 2006, today Narega almost has 266 works that they implement, and this has a huge range from infrastructure like roads, bridges, houses, which all have a climate resilient angle to it, a whole set of livelihood assets which could be done on community land or on private land, where you could do horticulture, agriculture related assets, water security related assets, livestock shelters, for example. So it's a very wide range of assets that you can also create through MG Narega, again leading to an additional level of income security. So again, coming from an inclusivity lens, I think MG Narega program coming up really gave a huge push to the women in India to really enter the employment field. So a lot of states where in India we also, of course, face issues of patriarchy, migration, and lack of education, and all of these from a gender inclusive lens, MG Narega really gave opportunity to women, especially from the most vulnerable and poorer households, to really come in the forefront and do work, get those wages, also use that income for their household level expenses, emergency expenses, and further for livelihood interventions. Coming to our projects is GIZ and the German Development Corporation. We have been engaging with MG Narega since the last 12 years, and we have had a range of projects which have been, let's say, building blocks on several topics. We started off with a project on natural resource management, which again has a very close linkage to the whole area of climate resilience. Here, what we did was really take the concept of public works and see how we can strengthen its contributions towards land, water, soil resource management. And that's where the whole GIS-based planning and digital planning approaches were really implemented. So in a way, we looked at how open source GIS data could be transferred to the community to help make their decisions on what kind of assets they need to make. Today, it is practiced across the country. We then had a project during the Corona experience, which was really focused on strengthening livelihoods. And here, with this informed planning processes, we really looked at how we could use public works for really creating incomes. So creating, let's say, a plantation through MG Narega, linking it to value chains. In India, we also have programs like the National Rural Livelihood Mission, which works with women collectives. So again, how to develop group enterprises and further strengthen incomes. And that was the project that also showed that we were able to take households from marginal incomes to actually a living income scenario. And today we just, I lead this project called AFSA on adaptive social protection, where now we are really looking at climate and disaster resilience through public works. And it's a great time because India plans to now launch its national adaptation plan in the COP that will just now happen. And it will look at 9 sectors, which also has one of the sectors as rural livelihoods and poverty alleviation. So we are really hoping, because in India, the public works program is under the Ministry of Rural Development, that we'll have a great role to also now officially play in the area of climate adaptation. So with that, Matthew, maybe back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mika. Yeah, I mean, thanks again for covering a sort of wide area, wide range of topics. I think a really interesting point there about how, essentially the program itself is inclusive by design, in that it quite literally pretty much includes everybody. But then, that's a fantastic starting point and a foundation, but then additional work is needed to zero in on, the impacts on women and on different groups, beyond the kind of basic core design of the program. But that core design is a real, strong foundation on which to build, yeah? Fantastic. Okay, thanks very much, Mika. So our third and final discussant is Patience Ogolo-Dixon. So she's the co-founder of the Advocacy for Women with Disabilities initiative in Nigeria. And I know that that they, as an organisation, have done work recently on disability inclusion into climate action. And released a recent report that also had, a few references to social protection as an important instrument. So, Patience, the question to you would be: okay, is this a relatively new agenda for you and your organisation, and for the kind of disability movement within which you work, and also, what kind of opportunities do you see, and also what challenges do you see for including people with disabilities more into social protection for inclusive climate action? Based on some of the findings that we've also been discussing earlier that the presenters were putting forward. So, Patience, over to you.
Thank you so much, Matthew and the team. Pardon me, I'm just on the road driving back a long distance, so I'll try and use the time. For us in advocacy for women with disability, it's climate change is something new, and for us as a country, Nigeria, climate change is not relatively new, but regarding the issue of persons with disability, it is new. The OPDs are doing a lot to ensure that persons with disability and their perspectives around climate change is not left behind. Yeah, because we are a women with disability organization, and then we also operate as an intersectional group that have to also look at some intersectional issues that affect women with disability. We came upon, okay, how can we document some of these challenges that women with disability and by extension persons with disability when it comes to climate change. And it prompted us to actually partner with some agencies, related agencies, like the Nigeria Meteorological Agencies, like the Ministry of Environment, the National Council for Climate Change, and all of that, about 8 to 10 related agencies. And we came up with a baseline survey looking at the policies that they have. These policies also reflect the disability component? Is it the climate inclusive policy that speaks to the issues of disability inclusion? And then at the end, we documented the gaps, because going through the whole of their documents or their policy, there was no one, not even a single one, that have a disability component. So every one of them are all generic. They speaks to the issue of climate change, but not related to inclusion. And that posed a kind of challenge and a gap. We have that document is on baseline survey on gender and disability inclusion policy in Nigeria. So Nigeria in itself we have experienced a lot of climate issues. We are in the heavy rain period now, and the flooding is raising a lot of havoc in our country. And then persons with disability are hugely affected. Just a few weeks ago, there was a big flood in a particular community, and one person with disability was up. I don't know how he got there, but he was up because the whole of the surface was filled with flood. So these are some of the issues that we have to, we are also looking at. Even when there is a kind of response, emergency response to also cushion the effects of this climate change, it's not, persons with disability are not even factored into that response, that emergency response. So they are often left behind, because you have to go and look for where these emergency measures are being distributed, and for you to go there, it takes a while. So having said that, in Nigeria we have also the social protection policy. Unfortunately, the social protection policy is also generic. It doesn't reflect the issues of persons with disability, although we have done a kind of a different framework now that have to look at disability components around social protection. And that's because Nigeria already has the conditional cash transfer, we have the health insurance, we have some other programs. But how are these programs actually benefiting the disability community is something that we are not really highlighting, that the country is really trying as much as possible to also see if many persons with disability are benefiting. Just a few of them says they are benefiting, not a lot actually. So this will be a great initiative for us to have a document or to have programs that reflect not only climate change, but also linking it or with social protection. Because if you look at the intersection that is going on between being a woman with disability and being affected with climate change, and you have to now look at how social protection, if it's not there, how do we also capture this community into the social protection programs? For example, in the conditional cash transfer, it captures households. So within this household, persons with disability are just members of the household. They are not heads of household. So whoever is, when these programs are in the community, it's only the heads of household that go that are actually captured within the program. So if the head of the household gets this conditional cash transfer, how do we know that the persons with disability under this household will also benefit? So many of these persons with disability say they don't even have a clue. They don't even know when these such programs are in the community. They are just told. And before they get there, they need to think of how they are going to, the cost of disability to those areas to go and take part, take part in it and all of that. So these are some of the challenges that we also experience in Nigeria. So having this document or having this kind of program that speaks not only on climate change, but also linking it to social protection will be a good idea and a wonderful idea to us in Nigeria, because many persons with disability, as from most of the presentations that we have listened to now, are within poverty level. Many of them are poor, and also they need a kind of safety net to also help them out of the issues they have in the area of social protection. Yeah, so that is what we have done in Nigeria as far as advocacy for women with disability is concerned, and and we are hoping that this will also reflect in our work. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Patience, and thanks for joining us while you're on the road. Safe travels. I think that was really helpful, really insightful. You know, this issue where you've got kind of generic policies on climate and generic also policies on social protection, where embedding disability into those policies in a meaningful way is a challenge, and then the intersection of all three, disability, climate, and social protection, to bring that all together. Yeah, is going to take a lot of the kind of coordination work that you've been discussing and that you've been, yourself kind of engaged with. So I think that's a really helpful insight for the rest of us about how that process works. Again, I would draw attention, for example, to the NDC in Cambodia that was flagged up in one of the earlier presentations as being a really, I think, useful example of where this can work. Obviously there's now a journey to kind of implement the NDC, but it is possible to do that, but it takes a lot of energy and advocacy, from the disability movement, but also from, all of the organizations involved in these policy spaces to transform that into kind of real action. So thanks very much, Patience. That was extremely helpful. We've got ourselves 15 minutes still for the Q&A. Sorry that it's slightly shortened, but I think we got a lot of really interesting inputs there from our speakers and our discussants. I can see a couple of questions already in the Q&A. So maybe we'll start with one round of those, and then we can also address further questions as they come up. Okay, so the first of those is from Edmi in Senegal, which is, okay, I think probably speaking a bit to, the points that Patience was raising there about, the key actions that governments have to implement to ensure greater resilience for women and particularly for disabled people. So perhaps we could do a sort of one more round where if there are reflections from either the discussants or our speakers on the kind of one key area for them that stands out in relation to disability inclusion in this agenda and in relation to working with governments specifically on this, that would be a helpful thing. So maybe if we go round, if people have comments on that. And then a specific question for Mika about MG Riga and whether it has design features that are targeted to the specificities of tribal populations within India. So maybe let's reverse this. Mika, if you want to start by addressing that question, and then we'll go and do a round of kind of points from discussants and speakers on the disability inclusion issue.
Sure, thanks, Matthew, and thanks, Marco. Nice to meet you. I think as we all know, MG Nariga is universal, right? So it is really up to the local governments to see how they use it. Under the IRADA project that we implemented in GIZ, we had a very specific focus on tribal populations. And here, I think what we try to do is, in India also, even if you say tribal, this is not everybody is not the same. Each tribal community is also very different. So I think our USP was still to look at how to do the local planning with their specific needs, because we focused on livelihoods. Here, we really wanted to see how to look at forest-based livelihoods, for example. How do we bring in some of those factors, like they look at honey collection, they look at very specific flowers from which they could make snacks. So how can we bring in certain elements of these under public works? How do we link it in convergence with the other programs so that then they really have resources for themselves? I think the really interesting aspect of using GIS-based maps was also that when we look at a hamlet and when we brought the geospatial information on top of it, and Narega also interestingly geotags every asset they create. So it's massive. They have, if we go online, we can see of all the assets that is already created. So if you sit with the community, you could really see that where are the assets concentrated, to really see how inclusive has the planning been, and doing that with the local government, with the tribal community, and with the general population. And this is where a lot of the gender transformative approaches, not just with women, but also including these marginalized communities, really worked. Some of these tools, we have a toolkit on our website as well. And I think that was an eye-opener to also see, okay, maybe, you know, your tribal hamlets really do not have assets. How to kind of increase their voice in the planning process. So those kind of interventions were also specifically bringing in these vulnerable groups. And on top of it, now you see my kid because it's close to 9 p.m. in India. Sorry, give me a minute. But also then really working with the local governments to see how it is important to kind of include them. So several programs, and so from that perspective, I think it is not saying that there's a universal application in the MG-NREGA Act, because the act is for everyone. And, you know, the real highlight is that how flexible it is to kind of use it at a local level for these different vulnerable populations, and then use it accordingly. Yeah, so thank you.
Thanks very much, Mika. That's really helpful. And thanks for joining us so late. I'd forgotten it was quite so late for you, so very much appreciated. Okay, so maybe if we go to the speakers and the discussants, if you would like to make a kind of point on, in relation particularly, I think, to disability inclusion and the inclusion of women with disabilities as well, which I think was the kind of core of the question. And I guess the focus was on kind of priorities in that regard, given that we know that financing is a constraint. So, you know, what is it that we should be prioritizing in the work with governments? Okay, Joseph, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to react to a few to the 2 points. The one was raised by Sarah about inclusion that need to be considering the cultural context when it comes to make sure that program are disability inclusive. I completely agree. That's why even in our review, we are recommending to be cultural sensitive, like in maybe sub-Saharan African context, when it becomes the terminology which attributed to person with disability, this is kind of creating stigmatization and exclusion of person with disability needs to be also part of the intervention. And this is why we are recommending using a Trini-track approach to ensure that the general community is there is the kind of awareness raising interventions that are being conducted to the general community as a mainstream wing to ensure that these practices are no longer there, so that we conduct our intervention in a culture appropriate way. So focusing on, targeting with a focus on the cultural context of a certain context, I think this is something we strongly recommend for inclusive social protection program for climate action. There's another question that I want to react. We did the presentation. In our presentation, we highlighted that we recommend use of different modalities, not using only one modality, where we also recommend the digitalization of approach and livelihood. So what we say here, it's not just focusing on one approach and you think maybe this one approach will be working for everyone. It's a triangulation with a different approach. We are not recommending only the digitalization. Yes, digitalization can help also people from communities which are very difficult to reach, but also there are some limitations of this approach. So we need also to incorporate different approaches to ensure that we reach to everyone. It's not only one approach that will be able to help to reach to participation, but it's a combination of different approach according to the needs and the available data. So we don't have, we have limited evidence on which is a clear program that we could maybe recommend. But generally, this is what I can say about this kind of digitalization that we recommended. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joseph. So the importance of a kind of context-specific approach, and then, you know, with tools like digitalization or agendas like digitalization, that, you know, these can be very important tools for inclusion, but, you know, we have to be careful about whether or not there are certain groups that are excluded if you roll these out. So, you know, again, I think the report goes into more detail about how this might play out in practice, but thanks for flagging that issue up. I think it's an important one to consider. Melk, I can see you've got your hand up, so over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. I think I just want to quickly go to the questions, and I think it's more like a reflection because it's a very good question with a good answer in it, considering the aspects of, you know, how to build a great resilience program. I think, and the links between climate change and adaptation and social protection, vulnerability and all that. I think I would like to look in terms of the context you have in Mozambique. I think it's a good example that the government has put some mechanisms in place. For example, the local adaptation plans bring opportunity for look in terms of group, marginal, vulnerable groups priorities. So it's a great opportunity to build this community-based network, bring all different groups and different interests into the planning process, starting from the district level. Look in terms of best climate resilience approaches and so on, providing that they are supported by some sort of capacity building information and so on. But also, I guess in part of the question has to do in terms of what are the challenges in terms of, you know, financing. And yes, that I think this is another aspect. I think in terms of challenges, we can look in terms of, as I said before, the coordination, because even Mozambique has a good example of putting together in place a mechanism like the local adaptation plans and have a great kind of set of social protection programs. They don't speak, they are not well coordinated. So I think bringing models that put this together would help a lot in terms of providing a greater resilience approach and programs. So in this case, I think that's what we want to do with the model that we are developing together with governments, to make sure that they coordinate well, they are well complemented in terms of many different policies and strategies. And look in terms of finance, this is a challenge to have a budget allocation for social protection. It's always a challenge. But I think look in terms of availability of climate finance and link that with existing social protection programs might be a possible solution. And I hope you can learn that in Mozambique, and I think we are in a good path looking forward. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, that's really helpful. And like I say, I think there is a huge amount to learn from the Mozambique context. You know, again, captured some of that in the report, and I think going forward, given the journey that you guys have been on and the kind of insights you're gaining as you move into, you know, the implementation phase of LINK, that I think are relevant for, you know, a whole range of different contexts. We can see how public works is a hugely, you know, it's a growing agenda in the climate space, and then also this, you know, the issue of local adaptation planning. You know, I think that touches also on the, you know, the approaches that Mika was describing as well around the use of GIS to look at assets that are being created and these kinds of approaches. How do you actually then get that down to kind of community level discussions? I'm aware that we've only got 3 minutes to go, and I'm afraid there was one question from Kenyonga in the chat that I'm not sure we're going to have time to address in detail about how do you actually include people with disabilities better into, let me have a look, into cash programming, and also how do you account for different levels of severity of disability when you're doing that, which is a super important question. I mean, I think it's addressed also more, it addresses more broadly issues about disability inclusion in social protection as a whole, not only in relation to climate action. So I was involved in some work in Nepal in the past, looking at their method for having different levels of severity in terms of disability registration processes that also tied to then social protection entitlements. So Kenyonga, sorry that we haven't got a chance to address that. I think we're going to have to close the seminar in 1 minute, unfortunately. So, but perhaps if you, yeah, perhaps our Oh, Fernanda can extend for 5-10 minutes. Okay, well, perhaps if we have one round finally of then responses where if anybody wants to speak to that issue around disability severity, we could go a couple of minutes over time. So perhaps either Anna or Joseph wants to offer their thoughts, or anybody else. And then I would also give Paola one last chance to reflect on what she's heard today and say one or two things to kind of close off from her perspective, having led this kind of broader piece. So maybe Joseph and Anna, if you've got one response to Kenyonga's question, and then over to Anna, over to Paola, sorry, for some last thoughts.
I think in terms of specific examples on how to go about different levels and severity of disability, I will let Joseph speak about this, but I wanted to take 30 seconds just to say that there are several experiences that social protection can draw from that are small-scale, grassroots-led schemes where OPDs are engaging at the level of the community in order to, for instance, deal with the issues of stigma that also has been raised on the chat, but also to kind of understand what are the actual different needs and provide a different capacity building, trainings, etc., so that persons with disability engage in climate action, climate smart agriculture, for example, according to their different capacities. So I think it's there's a lot happening at the grassroots level from where the social protection sector can draw experiences from. And Joseph, I don't know if you want to say something about examples that are, again, broader from the social protection and disability side in terms of how to go about the different levels of disability.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and in our review we found that some of the disability transfers, some are called disability grants. The beneficiaries is a person with severe disability, but the beneficiary of someone who is with on the name on the card or maybe bank account is the head of the household. And this grant does not really reach to the direct beneficiary. So I think the first thing is to ensure that we have accurate data, and which are not really very narrowed, as we said, based on the impairment in medical approach. Data which include what are the needs of the person, what is the level of the disability, what the severity of disability, so that this grant can be really targeted to address individual need, but also to address a broader need within the family household. You could maybe find there is a stigmatization within the household. There's maybe a conflict within the household. So there is also a need to have accurate data on what are the actual needs of this person, whether they have severe disability, but the needs are different. And then this grant can retarget to address identified issues, because the issue is availability or limited data, because different data systems are limited with this just determining an impairment, but not looking beyond an impairment and looking at different community, family, society barriers, so that these barriers also can be removed. I think this is what I can highlight here, just to look different angles and barriers, so that we make sure that we address the actual need, not the needs that we think this person has. Yep.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Joseph. I've also posted in the Q&A a link to a report looking at the Nepal system, which is about functional assessments of disability that can be carried out at a community level, that are then used to determine entitlements to social protection benefits. So it has a sort of, there's a banding basically that they implemented. So if that has some helpful insights there. Okay, so Paola, I'd come to you for a last few thoughts and reflections based on all the discussion you've heard. So if you can tie everything together beautifully, that would be fantastic.
That's a difficult task. All the discussions have been very interesting, and I'm compelled to see that there's such keen interest in these issues around disability. As I had mentioned, that often this is not necessarily incorporated as a specific dimension that should be looked at, and it's crucial, I think, drawing on the points that have been raised around this intersectionality and vulnerability, and we look at the different dimensions how they are the vulnerability and risk are compounded. It's important in the context of climate. And I think just highlighting one of the points that was asked around what governments can do, and then this also builds on Nika's points around this relevance of participation. But I think also what we saw from case studies, but also the broader sort of analysis of the evidence is that the relevance of sort of developing this capacity at the local level for sustainability. I think many of these efforts are really trying to develop tools, manuals, work at the community level and at the local government level to help an understanding of what these intersectional vulnerabilities actually mean, what gender equity means in practice in the context of social protection, climate change, what the real barriers are, what the social norm related barriers are, to understand, because sometimes we talk about these things and in practice they mean very concrete things around time burdens, around land access, etc. And I think the work that is being done is very relevant, very interesting to highlight. I think if we're talking about these insights for practice, I think this is, you know, looking from the bottom up and then how these then mirror at the national level in terms of reflecting on policies and legal frameworks is quite crucial. But yes, very, very interesting, and hopefully see more of this. We were talking during the research process, Matt, that you saw a lot of these programs, a lot of this thinking in the past, and suddenly sort of these types of programs have started to develop. So hopefully we'll see more of them in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paola. Okay, so I think we're moving towards the close now. So I just want to say a huge thank you to our speakers, to Anna, Paola, and Joseph, to our discussants, Melk, Mika, and Patience, and to everybody else for joining and for your questions. To flag up that the reports themselves will be ready later in the month, so please keep an eye out for them. There's a lot more detail in those reports that hopefully will be a great platform for us going forward as we seek to, you know, as Paola just said, kind of integrate this into more and more programs going forward. I think it is an emerging agenda. You know, we certainly found that there wasn't, I mean, in relation to disability specifically, a very limited set of examples. In relation to broader gender inclusion and the inclusion of other population groups, still only an emerging set, I think, of programs on the ground that are doing this through explicit design. So really, hopefully, this is something that can kind of catalyse further efforts in a lot of different contexts, and we can see how we can embed it in more and more programs as we go forward. So thanks also to all the authors, I'm sure they're on the call as well, of the reports who've been involved. There were big teams from OPM in the background, and also people from STAAR, so Anna McCord, who fed in a lot of detail, and Louisa Lippi as well from the STAAR side. And yeah, please do answer this survey. There's a QR code there about the session, because that helps socialprotection.org to you know, improve their sessions going forward. And I think I would just leave it there with a great big thank you to everybody involved, and hope everybody has a good afternoon, or in Nika's case, evening.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Matt.